Makwetla winds it down on African World Hour, 9 to 10 p.m.
2100 hours Central African time. It is a very good evening to you. A warm welcome to the Monday edition of Africa World Hour. I am indeed Tshepiso Makwetla. 60 minutes of the very latest news from the heart of Africa to all corners of the globe as we bring you plenty stories, one planet, as we also bring you the voices, the news and the perspectives that matter. And just a reminder, you can reach out to us, +270 634069126 if you want to share your perspective on some of the stories that we're covering. Let's go straight to your headlines. We start in the Sudan, where aid organizations say over 80% of Sudanese healthcare facilities are not functional. This comes as the conflict between the Sudan Armed Forces and the Rapid Support Forces continues to intensify. Recently, the RSF announced a parallel government. This is totally opposed by the army, of course, and international spokesperson of the Red Cross Committee in Sudan, Adnan Hazam, has this to say.
They need peace. They need safe haven for them and their kids. As you know, this escalation of the conflict is enforcing them to leave their homes. They displaced for many times to reach the safe place, to find where they can. There is a lot of challenges. In Sudan, the same, we are facing the challenging of access. But through our dialogue and talks with the parties of the conflict, we try to have that access. We managed to support more than 2 million Sudanese with our assistance.
In the Ivory Coast, representative of the African People's Party of Côte d'Ivoire, PPACI, Dr. Jean Zairaye Oyuro, says there is likely to be post-election violence. Thousands of Ivorians took to the streets in Abidjan, Ivory Coast, to protest against the exclusion of opposition leaders from the upcoming presidential election in October. Earlier this year, 4 main opposition figures, including the former President Laurent Gbagbo and former Credit Suisse chief executive Tidjani Thiam, were barred from running by the Electoral Commission. Last month, 83-year-old Alassane Ouattara announced that he would seek a 4th term. Oyure has more.
Now, given that the ongoing exclusion of key candidates, outrage from the opposition, and historical precedent of violence following contested terms, I am afraid if nothing is done, I think that we are running into some violence again, unless the government just come back and set some talks to ease all these anger from the opposition leaders and the population.
And that is what is happening in Côte d'Ivoire. We continue with some of our top stories. This time we talk about South Africa's National Health Department. It's once again condemned protests by Operation Tutula and other civic groups targeting healthcare facilities. This follows demonstrations where protesters blocked access to services based on nationality and documentation status. The Operation Tutula members were released on free bail today after storming a clinic in the south of Johannesburg after questioning patients about their nationality and demanding identity documents. The department spokesperson, Foster Mahali, has more.
We have since reached out to the leadership of Operation Tutula for a sit-down meeting in order to find long-lasting solution to these challenges. Of course, this is a societal issue. It's not mainly about health, but we believe that with sober minds, we can be able to find long-lasting solution.
And the Colombian senator and presidential hopeful Miguel Uribe has died from wounds sustained when he was shot at a campaign rally in June. He had been in hospital since the attack. The BBC's James Reid has those details.
The shooting of Miguel Uribe Turbay shocked Colombia and revived fears of a return to the political violence of the 1980s, when several presidential candidates were assassinated. The 39-year-old conservative was campaigning in Bogotá when he was shot in the head. 6 suspects have been arrested, including a 15-year-old boy accused of carrying out the attack.
And Indian police have detained dozens of opposition leaders in Delhi who were protesting at what they say are electoral malpractices. Around 300 MPs, including Rahul Gandhi of the main opposition Congress party, were heading to the Election Commission when they were stopped by police. Priyanka Chaturvedi is an opposition member of parliament, and this is what he says.
Election Commission of India का ही data दिखाकर बताया कैसे duplication of
We exposed the duplication of voters, bogus voters, and how the entire elections have been undermined by the Election Commission of India. ECI is working under the directions of the BJP, and they are not following the objective they were supposed to fulfill. By not letting us march towards the Commission, they are evading responsibility.
Africa. It's time to plug into the heartbeat of the continent. Tune in to Channel Africa, your go-to radio station that broadcasts in 5 different languages.
L'Afrique du Sud célèbre la journée nationale du
Kabla hujaitwa kwa jina la Double K or more of our forests have been destroyed.
Partido Africano da Independência da Guiné.
See, Channel Africa represents every corner of this amazing land. From Lagos to Cape Town, Nairobi to Dakar, we've got you covered with the freshest news, music, and cultures. So, turn up the volume, feel the rhythm. And join the conversation. Channel Africa, the African perspective. 1 hour, 1 continent, 1 voice. Africa World Hour with Tshepiso Makwetla on Channel Africa, the African perspective.
And it's just about 8 minutes past 9 here on Channel Africa, the African perspective. This is Africa World Hour. And on this Monday edition, we will later on speak to Human Rights Watch about what they call an unprecedented number of executions in Saudi Arabia. But first, we start with the latest developments on the Middle East crisis. Israel's plan to take control of Gaza City has received a broad repudiation during a rare emergency session at the UN Security Council on Sunday. Several ambassadors calling on the government of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to change course. Now, despite a growing global condemnation, the Israeli leader defended his cabinet-endorsed decision as an effort to free Gaza from Hamas, while describing it as the best way to end the war. The council met amid dire humanitarian conditions in the enclave, where the human catastrophe, including starvation, was laid bare. The United Nations Human Rights Office condemning the Israeli military and the killing of a prominent Al Jazeera journalist and several colleagues as a grave breach of international humanitarian law, said this during the session. Showan Bryce Peace was there and he reports.
While the emergency session in New York convened, Israel's Prime Minister made the case in Jerusalem for the proposed military escalation. One the UN Secretary-General has warned would lead to forced displacement, killings and massive destruction, compounding the unimaginable suffering of the Palestinian population in Gaza.
The war can end tomorrow if Gaza, or rather if Hamas, lays down its arms and releases all the remaining hostages. Gaza will be demilitarized. Israel will have overriding security responsibility. A security zone will be established on Gaza's border with Israel to prevent future terrorist incursions. A civilian administration will be established in Gaza that will seek to live in peace with Israel.
Sunday's emergency session saw countries line up to condemn or criticize Israel's proposal for Gaza City, urging a rethink of the plan. UK Deputy Ambassador James Kariuki.
As my Prime Minister said, this decision is wrong, and we urge the government of Israel to reconsider immediately. Expanding military operations will do nothing to bring an end to this conflict.
Chinese Ambassador Fu Kong.
The Israeli government needs to listen to the calls of both the international community and its people, immediately stop escalating tensions, and put an end to its military operations in Gaza.
Jade Armadikari is France's Deputy Ambassador.
La France condamne. Dans les termes les plus forts.
France condemns in the strongest possible terms the plan of the Israeli government to expand its military operations to take control of Gaza City with a view to establishing military control over the entirety of the Gaza Strip.
Pakistan's Ambassador Asim Iftikhar Ahmed.
The Prime Minister of Pakistan has strongly condemned the Israeli cabinet's decision to take control of Gaza City, calling it a dangerous escalation in an already catastrophic war against the people of Palestine.
Slovenia's Ambassador Samuel Bolgar.
Each time we come to this chamber to discuss the situation in Gaza, we come thinking that we cannot possibly reach new death. And yet we convene again today, following the reprehensible announcement by the Israel cabinet that it intends to expand its military campaign and take control of the Strip. Plan of horror and destruction.
A sentiment almost universal among the 15-member council, except for the United States, that remained steadfast in its support for Israel. Listen to Washington's envoy, Dorothy Shea.
Remarkably, instead of pressuring Hamas, members of this body have encouraged and rewarded its intransigence, actively prolonging the war by spreading lies about Israel, the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, and the United States, and by handing propaganda victories to terrorists.
Some members also called for the Council to impose sanctions against Israel and to authorize an international protection force for Palestinians, decisions that would likely encounter opposition from Israel and the United States. All this as the United Nations Human Rights Office condemned the killing by the Israeli military of 6 Palestinian journalists who were targeted in their media tent in Gaza City, calling it a grave breach of international law. The Committee to Protect Journalists said in a statement that it was appalled at the killing of several Al Jazeera staff, including correspondent Anas al-Sharif, after the media rights group in July flagged what it called an Israeli military smear campaign that sought to paint the journalist as a Hamas terrorist. CPJ says Israel had a long-standing documented pattern of accusing journalists of being terrorists without providing any credible proof, adding that with the latest killings, some 192 journalists had been killed since the start of the war in October 2023, the vast majority Palestinian. I'm Shervin Bryce-Pease in New York.
And from New York to Saudi Arabia, which has seen an unprecedented surge in executions this year, with at least 241 people put to death so far in 2025. Among them is Turki Al-Jasser, a journalist known for exposing corruption within the royal family. His execution has sparked widespread concern about the use of the death penalty to silence dissent. Joining us now to speak about this is Joey Shea, researcher for Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates at Human Rights Watch. Joey, a very good evening to you, and thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
So if we just look at the figures of 241 for 2025 this year, given the fact that we're halfway down the line, what have the figures been in the past couple of years, even 5, for instance?
Yeah, so the numbers that we're seeing this year are truly unprecedented. As you said, 241 individuals have been executed so far in 2025. And actually, we believe that number is now up to at least 242 in even the short period between when we wrote this press release and the time that it came to publication. And looking at these figures, if they continue along the same rate, this year, 2025, will be the largest number of executions in Saudi Arabia's history, unfortunately.
And this spike, what has led to it?
That's a very important question. A few years ago, Mohammed bin Salman had promised publicly to curtail Saudi Arabia's use of the death penalty. And actually, for a few years, we saw somewhat of a decrease in executions. Unfortunately, over the last few years, this number has steadily increased. Last year was a historically high year, and this year, as I explained, is on track to be even higher. from our position as Human Rights Watch, we believe that the impunity that Mohammed bin Salman has enjoyed over the last few years has led to this massive increase in executions, unfortunately.
So, as we mentioned in the introduction, we spoke about Turki Al-Yasser, a journalist who was executed for the work that he was doing. Are there many like him in his profession, or is it, across the board, anybody who is seen as dissenting to the authority of the royal family, that this is their fate?
Yeah, so Turki Al-Jasser was the first journalist that we have been able to document as being executed or murdered by the Saudi regime since the brutal murder of Jamal Khashoggi in 2018. And if you recall, Jamal Khashoggi's murder caused widespread international outrage. And unfortunately, Turki Al-Jasser's execution on June 14th of this year, just 2 months ago, didn't elicit such a response. Now, we document many cases of journalists, influencers, civil society members being arrested and detained for peacefully exercising their freedom of expression. However, so far, Turki Al-Jasser is an outlying case whereby we see a journalist actually being executed by the state for his Twitter account and for his journalistic work. So this is, unfortunately, perhaps the beginning of an even deeply disturbing trend.
And was this done officially, or was it under other charges that would have been trumped up to justify the eventual outcome?
Yeah, so in the statement that was released by Saudi Arabia's Ministry of Interior on June 14th, so the day that Turki Al-Jasser was executed, they said they accused him of a litany of terrorist crimes. Now, in the statement, they offered no evidence to support these claims. And in fact, we have very little details and information on Turki Al-Jasser's trial, his period in detention, and in fact, the ultimate decision to hand down the death penalty to him and then execute that penalty. And in fact, his family had visited him very shortly before he was executed, and they had no idea that he had, number one, been sentenced to death, and number two, was up to be executed very shortly thereafter. So his trial, his detention, every part of his case was shrouded in absolute secrecy. And so there's no way that this man received a fair trial nor his full due process rights.
You speak about rights, and you also speak about the legal system. I know from the report that you put out that you are working with an organization, also a human rights organization called Reprieve. From what you have been able to gather and what Reprieve, the work that they've done, just in terms of analyzing the criminal justice system and its complicity in these executions, is there any judicial independence at all?
Absolutely not. There is no judicial independence in Saudi Arabia. And in fact, the data that was collected by Reprieve in terms of executions this year, so the 241 individuals, or now 242, we were able to very soundly assert that it's unlikely that any of these individuals received a fair trial before they were executed, given the rampant due process violations and fair trial violations that we have documented over decades in Saudi Arabia. And these include long periods of detention without trial, forced confessions and the use of torture to elicit confessions, any lack of legal assistance throughout this period. And those are just a few of the rampant due process violations that are intrinsic to Saudi Arabia's criminal justice system.
So Al-Jasser was about in his 40s, I understand, and I just want to look at the hundreds of people that have been executed. Do they range in ages, and also what are they accused of doing? And I'm just trying to get a sense of the demographic that has been, executed as a result of this. Were they social activists? Were they members of civil society? Were they politicians? Just to get a sense of how far and wide the dissent is within Saudi Arabia against the regime.
Absolutely, and this is a really important question. So it does seem that Turki al-Jasser was somewhat of an outlier in terms of executions and the death penalty, in that he was a journalist and he was apparently executed for merely his peaceful journalistic work. Reprieve and other organizations have found that the majority of executions that have happened this year have been for nonviolent drug-related offensive, and in fact, a large portion of those individuals are non-Saudis, they're foreigners, they're Egyptian, they're Pakistani, they're from outside of Saudi Arabia. So it's not the case that the state is using the death penalty en masse to silence dissent. But Turki al-Jasser's case is it's cause for concern, and it is sort of a watershed moment that this is the first time that the state has legally executed a journalist. As I said, with Jamal Khashoggi, there was many lies about how he was murdered in the days and hours after his killing came to light, and it only took years of investigative journalistic work for individuals to understand that he was murdered by Saudi agents and likely on the order of Mohammed bin Salman himself. Whereas in the case of Turki al-Jasser, it's right there in the Ministry of Interior's own statement that they executed him and he was a journalist. But yeah, it's not accurate to say that there are many civil society members or many peaceful dissidents who are being executed, but we don't know where this trend may be going.
And that's actually my next question, because I see that a member of the academia, that is Islamic scholar Salman al-Oda, that there's a push apparently by Saudi prosecutors to seek the death penalty there, and that's because of his association, and I don't know whether it's sympathies or with statements made by reformist thinker Hassan Faram al-Maliki. So is that also part of what would be described as terrorist acts?
Yeah, so there's a few other cases where individuals have been either, sentenced to death, but the execution has not been carried out, or we've received indication that prosecutors may be seeking the death penalty, and these are the cases that you rightly mentioned here. So Salman al-Auda, Hassan Farhan al-Maliki, they're both. Salman al-Auda is a very prominent Islamic scholar and interpreted to be a dissident, and he's been imprisoned for many years now, as has Hassan Farhan al-Maliki. And again, the death penalty hasn't yet been carried out in these cases, but we do understand that prosecutors are maybe seeking the death penalty in these cases, which is deeply disturbing. And so that's why, we're concerned with the case of Turki al-Jasser, because so far, the death penalty has sort of been hanging over these cases, but not yet actually executed. And we're concerned that Turki al-Jasser's case may be a sort of turning point in the road, and Saudi authorities may actually increasingly carry out the executions themselves. We also documented a case a few years ago of a retired teacher, a man named Mohammed al-Ghamdi, who was originally sentenced to death based purely on his peaceful social media activity. His death sentence was later reduced, we think, due to public pressure. But again, there's a few of these cases that are hanging around that we're fearful may end up in the same way as Turki al-Jasser, unfortunately.
And I'm curious about that. The public pressure brought to bear, what was it that dissuaded the regime from pursuing that action that they already were on? Because I'm thinking in terms of the Arab Charter on Human Rights, of which Saudi Arabia is a signatory, would a statute like that enforce greater pressure against weaponizing the death penalty for repression, or was there something else that swayed them in this case?
I would hope that it was the Arab Charter on Human Rights, but unfortunately, I think Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman really does not care for any of these international treaties, even the ones to which Saudi Arabia is signed. In the case of Mohammed al-Ghamdi, the retired teacher, I believe that his death sentence was commuted because, this was a story that went viral, a teacher sentenced to death for tweets. And Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman was actually asked about this case himself specifically in an interview with Fox News, where he said, there are many laws in this country that are old laws that we're working to change. This was, of course, a lie because the law under which Mohammed al-Ghamdi was sentenced to death was a new law passed in 2017 during the period in which Mohammed bin Salman has come to power. But I think the fact that this Fox interviewer asked him specifically about this case gave Mohammed al-Ghamdi a degree of protection, because ultimately Mohammed bin Salman really cares about Saudi Arabia's international reputation. He wants to attract foreign investment, he wants to attract tourism, and it's ultimately bad for business if the country is having headlines because they're executing teachers for tweeting.
And given that, just as a final question, then visits like that from President Donald Trump to Saudi Arabia, would that be impetus enough that should there be a wider and louder outcry that he and his regime would be dissuaded from further actions such as these?
Yeah, I would hope that, visits by Western leaders from countries who at least profess to care about human rights would make a difference. I mean, I do think that over the past many years, we've seen these relationships for what they are, which is largely transactional. And, we just have to look at all of the, abuses that are happening right now in the United States to see through this sort of hollow veneer of, these countries and what they profess to believe in their human rights records. As I said, it would be our hope for these different visits to give a degree of protection and to help, encourage human rights. But ultimately, I think for the U.S. and for Saudi Arabia, the economic relations and trade relations trump, for lack of a better word, everything else.
Well, Joey, thank you so much for speaking to us, and we will obviously keep tabs on this and speak to you about any further such incidents and if there's been a change in trend. Joey Shea is researcher for Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates at Human Rights Watch, speaking to us about what they've noticed as a surge in executions in Saudi Arabia in 2025, speaking specifically about, in this case, the case of journalist Turki Al-Jasser. Brings the time to 28 minutes past 9. You are listening to Africa World Hour here on Channel Africa, the African perspective.
Gender-based violence is destroying lives and tearing communities apart. It happens in homes, in schools, at workplaces, and too often in silence. But it doesn't have to continue. If you see it, speak out. If you are hurting, reach out. Because doing nothing is not an option. Listen to all 19 SABC radio stations from Wednesday, 23rd of July for hard talk, discussions, advice, dramas, educational shows, and interviews around GBV with experts, survivors, lawmakers, and the whole country affected by gender-based violence. For all your favorite SABC radio stations, call 0800 428 428 to report abuse or get help. GBV, it ends with you. This message is brought to you by the SABC.
Você é fluente em português? É apaixonado por rádio e quer trabalhar na África do Sul? Você tem documentos que o qualificam para trabalhar na África do Sul? Nesse caso, podemos ter uma oportunidade para você trabalhar no Canal África. Envie seu currículo e demonstração para Canal África at newsroom@channelafrica.co.za. Lembre-se, se você não receber alguma resposta nossa em 14 dias, isso significa que você não foi selecionado. Canal África, a perspectiva africana.
The pulse of the continent in 60 minutes. Stay informed and inspired with Africa World Hour on Channel Africa.
And indeed, we do have our fingers on the pulse of what's happening from the heart of Africa to all corners of the globe as we bring you the very latest and, of course, important news from political developments, economic developments, where we talk about health and sustainability issues, you name it. We bring it to you here on Channel Africa. And, of course, we'd like to hear your perspectives. We are on social media platforms, YouTube, TikTok, on Instagram, at Channel Africa 1. You can also speak to us on Facebook as well, Channel Africa, and you can also email us, info@channelafrica.com. We'd like to hear from you. Just share your thoughts with us. What's happening in and around your community? What are the issues that are driving your conversations? So let's take you back to the Sudan. As you know, it's a story that we have been covering quite extensively, as the violent conflict between forces of the Sudanese military and their rival Rapid Support Forces militia rages for its third year. Women are facing the brunt of the humanitarian crisis. Female-led households struggle to access food. Girls and women face high risks of not only exploitation and abuse when trying to access humanitarian aid. All the while, accessible women-run organizations are vastly under-resourced. Salvatore Nkurunziza, the UN women representative in the Sudan, sat with UN News' Abdelmonem Maki to discuss the struggles facing women in the Sudan and the solutions that could be implemented.
Women are central to the survival of their households, especially in displacement settings, but their ability to access food assistance is deeply compromised. But because of the female-headed households are already 3 times more likely to be food insecure, are now the hungriest group in the country. Food queues are often dominated by men compared to women. At the same time, women are largely left out of community targeting mechanisms and decision-making space. So their specific needs and those of their families are frequently overlooked.
And how would you describe the experience of women and girls in Sudan when it comes to their rights and the specific issues they face in getting food assistance compared to men?
Yeah, well, before the conflict already, women and the girls face challenges in accessing their rights due to cultural norms and the traditional practices. Now, the conflict has actually widened the gaps. The current conflict has caused significant disruptions, leading to many Sudanese women leaving their homes and losing their sources of livelihoods. Adolescent girls are dropping out for schools to search for food, putting themselves at high risk of exploitation. Across all regions, we are seeing increased harmful and negative coping mechanisms to severe food because of severe food insecurity, such as child marriages, sexual exploitation, female genital mutilation, and child labor, all linked to insecurity and access.
Has the increase in gender-related crimes prevented women from obtaining food for their household?
Indeed, this crisis is a gender emergency. Displaced women and girls can be subject to the risks of exploitation and abuse, especially during the delivery of aid, where protection from sexual exploitation and abuse mechanisms are weak or totally absent in some locations. According to the Unit for Combating Violence Against Women in Sudan, as of March 2025, there has been 1,138 cases of rape recorded since April 2023, including 193 children, most of whom were in the conflict-affected areas. The actual number may be higher, as fear of stigma and other social and security reasons prevent accurate reporting of gender-based violence crimes, in many cases in the fear of retaliation or exclusion and marginalization by the communities. Certainly, these crimes including rape and harassment, can be prevented and indeed, unfortunately, prevent women and girls from access to food assistance.
Has the conflict exacerbated systematic inequalities against women? And what needs to be done to ensure gender-responsive strategies to provide food and aid to women-led households?
Absolutely. According to the recent gender snapshot, nearly 26% of all female-headed households are now experiencing severe food insecurity compared to just 14 1 year ago. To make the response more gender responsive, we need to move beyond rhetoric into action and move now. To ensure access to various locations, include conflict-affected areas, and ensure the reinforcement of protection of women and girls and the humanitarian workers. Female-headed households must be explicitly prioritized in the food distribution and assistance planning. Distributions should be localized and proximity-based to reduce movement-related risks of women. We need to invest in the community kitchens and informal food networks run by women-led organizations who are often reaching the hardest hit population. Increase funding to women-led organizations as they are receiving less than 2% of fund of humanitarian aid. Women must be guaranteed 40% representation in the local aid committees and decision-making spaces. Food security programming should be linked to psychosocial, counseling, medical, and the legal services for gender-based survivors because the two issues are deeply intertwined. This is the time for the system to acknowledge that gender-neutral responses are failing. Gender must shape targeting, delivery, and accountability.
Mr. Salvatore, could you please elaborate further on the contributions of women-led organizations on the front lines, specifically on the challenges they face?
This cannot overemphasize. Women-led organizations are the backbone of the response in the many areas where the international system cannot reach due to insecurity, restrictions, or lack of access. Women-led organizations are already there, operating under immense strain. For instance, in West Kordofan, women-led organizations are running nutrition outreach, managing mobile maternal health, and operating informal shelters. In North Kordofan, women-led organizations are distributing food, running protection hotlines, and helping displaced families find safety, often without a single dollar in institutional funding. In Khartoum, women-led organizations are working to coordinate response rooms and documenting women's status as a large number of families are beginning voluntarily returning to Khartoum and the nearby areas. We are witnessing women-led organizations coming together to support each other with whatever resources they have available. And yet, they remain underfunded and unrecognized. Despite all this, women-led organizations are still feeding women families. They are not waiting for permission. They are responding. The question is whether the system will finally recognize them as an equal partner or continue to leave them behind.
Tawila in northern Darfur, where thousands of people fled from violence in Al-Fashir, and the UN agencies warn about the dire situation there in Tawila area. If you can briefly tell us about that.
In North Darfur, including ongoing Al-Fashir that is under siege for the last year or so, the situation is dire and impossible to access. The fighting is ongoing. They are in many cases controlled by SRF and, of course, the government trying to fight for the last tranches. So access has been very, very difficult. As you probably know, 2 months ago, a full convoy of the World Food Programme trying to reach out the Zamzam El Fasher regions was targeted, and more than 5 people were killed as part of the convoy. So it has been absolutely very difficult. These regions are at the edge of famine. The international community really need to advocate for not targeting humanitarian assistance, humanitarian response, while actually negotiating, lead and support the peace processes.
And that report there by UN Media, that was Salvatore Nkurunziza, the UN Women representative in Sudan, speaking to UN News' Abdel Monem Maki, brings the time to exactly 20 minutes to 10. Now, the SABC is pleased to announce the launch of its new self-registration platform. So vendors wishing to do business with the SABC can now self-register on our internally developed platform. Vendors are able to access this platform on our website. Just simply go to www.sabc.co.za/SABC/ and under e-tender or self-register at etender.sabc.co.za. Just follow those prompts. Visit SABC social media pages for more details.
1 hour, 1 continent, 1 voice. Africa World Hour with Tsepiso Makwetla on Channel Africa, the African perspective.
And we continue now with Africa World Hour, a 2140 feature. And today we talk about this, an important anniversary coming up, particularly in the literary jazz poetry circles. So we talk about an event that is taking place very soon to mark the anniversary, 5 years on since the passing of Maisha Jenkins, a pioneer of spoken word in South Africa, and of course an icon of feminist creativity and action. She was more than a poet. Maisha Jenkins was a voice, a bridge, a pulse in the rhythm of South Africa's literary heart. Through her words, she carved spaces where stories could breathe, spaces where the page met the stage and the stage met the soul. Today we remember her not only for what she wrote, but what she made possible. Joining us now is her friend, journalist, a feminist writer, human rights activist, and fellow cultural worker, Gail Smith, to reflect on the legacy, the lessons, and of course the love that Maisha Jenkins gave to the world and she received. A very good evening to you, Gail. Thank you so much for speaking to us.
Good evening, Tippy. Good evening to your viewers and listeners. And what a beautiful introduction of Maisha. Thank you.
Well, we thought something inspired to really reflect who she is. As I mentioned, the fact that she inspired many across generations, and which is why we have seen over the years, Gail, her being paid homage to not only in articles, but I believe there is something that is happening tomorrow. Tell us a little bit more about how she's going to be remembered.
Right. So tomorrow, the Wits School of Creative Writing, under the leadership and auspices not of the institution but of the event of Philippa de Villiers, who's a lecturer in creative writing and was one of Maisha's very, very good friends and another poet and phenomenal writer, is organizing a memorial. And it will be a reading. There will be reading by Krista Kuljan, Makosazana Kaba, and Maren Bodenstein. Now, both Krista and Kosi Kaba were also very good friends of Maisha's. So these are women in the literary world who are gathering to recognize her work, and just women in literature in general, but specifically to recognize Maisha's 50th anniversary of her passing.
And I want to talk about, she was herself, considered a cultural architect. Her entry into the South African spoken word movement, what role would you say she played in building that foundation, particularly in its formative years?
Well, she was very, very active, and Maisha was very driven by the need to build community. She always spoke about that if you just had trophies and awards and money, but you had no community, then what is it worth? So she was never about self-aggrandizement or being a star. She was very much about becoming part of the poetry community and then became a driving force in the poetry community. I think she gave a lot of support and succor and guidance to a lot of younger poets. I think she broke barriers so that younger and other poets could create space. So she played a very important role. And then, of course, she just had very deeply embedded friendships as well. So a lot of the poets that she was working with were women that were good friends of hers. So she was doing more than just building a poetry community. She was actually building a very real community and a family, because she had made South Africa her home. So she was a fun person to be around. She was much older than all of us, but she just had this girlish joy about her. So she really never, ever saw age. She would just go places that she would least expect her to be.
And when you speak about that, Gail, I remember the one time that I met her. It was at a lunch. It was an intimate lunch, and she was full of a lot of warmth. But I'm pretty sure I spotted her at several other events. I'm thinking of old Yeovil days where you and I actually have met several times at that scene. And she certainly was somebody with a great deal of energy, but purposeful energy.
Absolutely, and she was a diehard Yeovilite. I mean, she came to South Africa in 1993 and really did embed herself in Yeovil. And that's, in fact, where her and I met. We ended up being neighbors in a beautiful building, and the rest was history. But, yeah, I mean, she really made Yeovil her home. And in those early days when there was so much creativity and hope and passion and sex and drugs and kwaito, she really, really made that her home, and she deeply embedded in the community. And you could go to Maisha's house on any day of the week, and you would find a plethora of artists visiting her, You'd come from one day, it would be, Zamnawana. The next day, it would be Kosi Kaba. The next day, it would be somebody else. She just had quite an amazing array of people in her life. And so our home was really a mecca for a lot of us. It was a place that we just dropped in after work. Many of us, you'd arrive after work at Maisha's house and there'd be somebody else interesting sitting around discussing poetry or just having a gossip. And she never let age stand in her way, She used to go out to jazz clubs. She was a regular at all of the jazz clubs. She knew all of the musicians. She was friends with them. She worked with them. And she would tell the story about coming home very late one night and being pulled over by Metro cops. And they looked at her and they were shocked by this old lady being out at night. And they said, "How, Mama? Where are you going to this time of the night? What are you doing?" And she looked up, and in her southern drawl, she said, "I'm just living my life, officer. I'm just living my life," So that was her. She was bold, she was courageous, and she really made Johannesburg her home.
And I'm glad you took her to jazz, because I was going to ask you about that next. Her life's work, her editing, To Breathe Into Another Voice, that landmark anthology of jazz poetry. Just speak to me about how her work reflected the philosophy of poetry as a bridge between art forms, communities, and generations.
Absolutely. I mean, I think she was always a very big poet. She was doing a lot of writing, but she only really found her voice as a poet in South Africa. Before that, she had written poetry, and it was on the page. And I remember many a conversation with her at her home where I used to push her and say, "Maisha, poetry is not a written form. The written is secondary to poetry. It's spoken. You have to get up and out and on the stage and be speaking your poetry." And eventually, of course, she found the courage and she went out and did it. But because she loved jazz so much and was so deeply embedded in the Johannesburg jazz community, she did start to collaborate with quite a few jazz musicians. And really, obviously, I mean, the connections between, jazz and poetry are obvious. And so, yeah, she was very, very active in both of those communities. And when she passed away, both, the poetry and the jazz community really, really came out to honor her. But she was a regular at most jazz clubs in South Africa, and she really, really did support jazz and the development of young jazz artists as well.
So again, one of the concerns raised in recent years is the loss of those spaces for open mics, the very spaces that Maisha helped champion. In your view, what has led to that? And what do you think her view would be of their absence today in today's poetry culture?
You know, I often wonder what she would make, and I speak to her every day, and then I imagine her answering me back in her accent, you know. I think she would be devastated by the loss of those spaces because she knows how hard they were to establish. Maisha worked very hard to have the spaces that she was working in, whether it was Feel a Sister or having a radio show on jazz or having regular Sunday jazz communities. She worked hard. I used to see her doing that work. So I think she would, excuse me, I think she would be devastated by the loss of those spaces and be very, very, very sad. But yeah, I mean, I think that we are all, you know, we're all at a loss for a lot of those spaces. But then other spaces have opened up. So I don't think it's all just, you know, downhill. But I do think that the spaces that she had established that are no longer there, it is very sad. I think there has been, as people have left Yeovil, I think a lot of those connections dissipated, and I think it is very sad. I mean, about the state of poetry today, I have no idea because I'm not even sure. I'm not sure who the young hot poets are at the moment. To my eternal shame, I have to admit that I've somewhat fallen out of it. I'm still in touch with the old guard. But you know, I'm not a despairer, and Maisha was a very optimistic person who, because she came to South Africa she came when she was 40. So she had lived through the civil rights in the United States. She had seen a country turn a corner and then came here and watched another country turn a corner. And she was always very philosophical about the cyclical nature of these things, you know, civilizations rise and fall, you know. And she was always very interested in engaging with young people. So I think that irrespective of what the status of poetry is today, she would probably have been as involved and as encouraging as she was back then.
So let's drill down to that nurturing spirit. What did she do in particular, especially for women and black poets? Her mentoring approaches, if you could just share them with us, her values on ensuring that they're part of the current or even past slam-dominated environment.
Well, I mean, I think she was very concerned and irritated by it was very male-dominated. You know, there was suddenly this, you know, widespread groundswell of slam poetry, and poetry was really rocking in Joburg, and there were so many poetry events. But women were often not on the bill, or when they were given short shrift. It was a very, very boys' clubby thing. And Maisha had already, you know, she also, I just must make it very clear that she wasn't just this overarching auntie who nurtured. She also learned a lot and acknowledged that she learned from people, and South Africa really shaped who she was. But I think that because she was immersed, in fact, the way Feel a Sister came about was that her and Nsiki Mazwai and Napo Mashiane had been at a writer's workshop in Port Elizabeth. Then it was called Port Elizabeth, current Kabeja. They were there, and they were completely sidelined. They were not called on during discussions. They weren't included in the open mics. They weren't being heard in plenaries. So Maisha was having a cigarette with Nsiki, and they were furious, and then Napo joined them, and the three of them were furious about this. And then they decided, when we get back to Johannesburg, we're going to do something about it. So they got back to Joburg, and they put out a call to another 12 poets and writers that they knew personally, and said, hey, we're going to start this collective because we're tired of being squeezed out by the boys. Come and join us. And it was only Lebo Mashile who responded, and that's then how Feel a Sister came about, with Maisha, Nsiki, Napo, and Lebo Mashile, and that's kind of how it came about. You know, and I mean, she was just very, you know, she was very nurturing, because South Africans are very respectful of older people. So everywhere she went, people would be calling her mama and according her respect. And I think Maisha took that respect with the grace that it was given. And she was certainly very helpful and encouraging of young poets who would reach out to her or ask her for help. She really, really was encouraging. And I watched a lot of people bloom and flourish around her because she made them feel that they could do it. And of course, South Africans are so enamored by an American accent. So, people would just, I love being her friend because I swear, we got away with murder. Maisha would just speak and the American accent and things would happen. So, yeah.
So I'd like to hear your views, Gail, as a writer and a feminist writer, that just your thoughts on the role of poetry today, and particularly in terms of published literature. Would you say there is a deliterarization of poetry? Are we seeing it more digitized? Is there less of the printed page in this culture that we live in?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I think that I fall between two stools. On the one hand, I think there's been such an amazing wave of South African publishing, especially young black writers, in the last 20 years. I mean, you just look at it, the literary landscape has exploded. So I think there's a deep appreciation for the need for literature and the need for published literature. I do think that the digital environment does change things, and I certainly think that the advent of AI will no doubt change it, I think it will be a game changer, definitely. I don't think it's a bad thing that literature becomes a thing of the people as opposed to this high art. I think that, young people are taking it into digital spaces, but I also see lots of young people pushing the old traditions of just spoken word and poetry and slams, and I think that even if they are standing up and only doing it for TikTok or for Twitter or for any of the platforms, they're still writing it down somewhere. So it still exists as an artifact, as a written artifact.
And just finally, as her friend, as we approach that anniversary on the 5th of September, how would you say you carry forward her legacy and, the mentorship, as you've spoken about, the friendship? How are you putting it out in the world?
I've been thinking about it, and I don't know. I might just write a small something, because her legacy in my life, Maisha made the woman that I was. There was a 20-year age gap between us, and I kind of grew up with her. She taught me so much about what it means to be a woman, what it means to be a black woman. She really helped me understand, navigate whiteness and its recuperative powers. She just taught me the most basic things about life. She was genuinely like that older sister that we all needed and wanted, She had a great sense of humor. Again, the community thing. Through her, I've met and become friends with some amazing people. So, I would not be the person that I was had it not been for her. She was, after my mother and, my immediate family, she was a profound influence in my life and exactly what I needed, because I was I think I was a very uptight young woman.
Okay.
And it was Maisha who
Gail,
told me to relax.
Gail, thank you so much for sharing that really enjoyable conversation, and hope to speak to you in due time when you do release that your contribution to her legacy. Gail Smith, a feminist writer, journalist and human rights activist, speaking to us about Maisha Jenkins and her legacy, how she showed us that poetry is not just an art, it's an act of living. She reminded us that words are seeds, and when planted in open hearts, they grow into change. Well, just a minute to go. Let's find out what's coming up on Hotlines this evening. Shayla and Kumana in the studio.
Listen, I'm huffing and puffing. You would have thought that this would have solved for X with respect to the stairs. No. That's what I'm saying. Okay. I'm huffing and puffing from the stairs.
There's always something that happens. I got caught in a roadblock.
No.
I don't know how I always find them on my way to work, but
you're a good tracker, ma'am. That's what we'll say. So on the show today, we are talking reproductive health, right? Awareness. we talk about checkups as though they are suggestion. Like, I'll go get checked up. I'll go get this done. I'll have a pap smear. I'll have a breast cancer checkup, as though it were a suggestion, as though these issues are not real. And what we're going to do is just travel throughout the landscape of the African continent to gauge, are women cognizant of the reality that you need to go see your gynae? You really need to go get yourself checked up. What?
One word from me.
Tell me.
As a health activist, public health activist, cost. It is prohibitive.
Okay.
The lack of health insurance. I don't think there is a woman or a girl who, if they could, would forego those monthly, yearly, whatever milestone checkups that they would go through.
Here's the thing. There are spaces that give you, firstly, free consult, right? So, for example, breast checkups, just for cancer. That's free now, but in certain spaces in the African continent. And I think for me, the conversation is more awareness.
That's what I was going to say.
Right.
Are they aware, and are there enough of them? And let's talk about accessibility.
Yeah.
When you are in some rural village and they tell you about something that's happening in a town or province, of what good use is it? What state, far away from you?
Yeah. I also do think that the conversation around its importance is something that needs to be uttered. Because again, to your point, if you're speaking to somebody who's based in the inlands and you're telling them about a message that will come every year, as though it's almost like we don't talk about it enough for people to recognize how important it is. And I think that's part of the crux and core of that conversation. Of course, this alongside some commentary coming in from our guests, as well as people on TikTok, because they have a lot to say about this as well. And so that is what it comes up on the show today.
That's why it's called TikToko.
We talk a lot.
Thank you very much. That's Hotlines up next from us. Says goodbye.